Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cybersecurity Sauna. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and I will be your sauna majuri and the host of this podcast. Thank you for joining us for another session where we sweat out the hot topics in security. Welcome to all our listeners, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at CyberSauna. Security protects organizations from cyber attacks. However, studies show that limiting your understanding of security to this basic premise can hinder protection efforts and even other business goals. Instead of spending more and more on security to simply keep things running, maybe it's time for a different approach. Today we're joined by WithSecure Chief Information Security Officer Christine Bejerasco and guest speaker Laura Koetzle, Vice President and Group Director at Forrester, to learn more about a strategy called outcome-based security. So Forrester has done some research on how companies currently approach security. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Laura?
Sure. So some colleagues of mine recently did a study of about 400 cybersecurity and IT decision makers in 8 countries, in the US and Japan and the rest of the countries here in Europe. And most of those companies were between, just to give you a sense for who these people are, were between 500 and 5,000 employees. So a fairly broad range, but gives you a fair bit on the larger end. And what we were looking for in that study is to figure out how are they approaching security today? What kind of challenges do they face that they still aren't really sure how to surmount, quite frankly? And what are they thinking about doing about those challenges that they haven't tried before? Because a lot of these approaches are things we're all familiar with that we've all been doing for many, many years. And one of the things I've said for the last several years is eventually people are going to stop giving us more money because we're not really getting any better. So this research is to see, okay, how are people thinking about this? Do we feel like we've gotten to the end of the rope, as it were? And what kind of new approaches can we take? And that one of those new approaches is what we're going to talk about today with outcome-based security.
Okay, so before we get that far, what are some of the problems that are cropping up because of the way companies are approaching security today?
So if you look at the results, you'll see a lot of we're still not addressing cyber attacks as well as we'd like to be. We're still not as good at complying with the rules and regulations as we'd like to be. We're still spending too much money and not getting enough return, or at least that's how a lot of our stakeholders feel. We aren't necessarily very good at aligning our security goals with our business goals and showing how the one contributes to the other, and indeed investing in the right things to support the business goals. So you see a lot of room for improvement in these results, as it were.
Absolutely, and I do agree with Laura, because what we have seen as well is that there's a tendency to overinvest in one area, and then there may be areas that are actually forgotten. And the challenge with this is to identify, for example, when doing risk management within an organization, to identify which areas actually to prioritize. And if for other areas, do you even have risks that you can fix? And this is becoming more and more of a cat and mouse game nowadays, because new threats come in, and therefore cybersecurity people within the organization try to figure out, okay, do we have protection capabilities against these threats? And then you add new protection capabilities, and then you add new technologies, and new threats come in for those new technologies, and then you add new protection capabilities. And it becomes sort of like this vicious cycle, just becomes costlier and costlier as time goes.
Yeah, and also you're focusing on the latest thing, the latest, hottest new thing that popped up, and sort of maybe ignoring the basics.
Exactly, and there is unfortunately a tendency to do that sometimes less is more in cybersecurity, because all of these defense capabilities that you add in, they are technologies as well. They are software as well. They have vulnerabilities as well. So are they making things better for you, or would you be better off if you just removed some of the things that you have in your estate?
That's absolutely right. And the thing that contributes to that is also a challenge that a lot of our respondents saw that I forgot to mention earlier is the complexity. So when you do that and you build up a bunch of different layers of solutions to different but related problems that then you have to maintain over time, not only do you get solutions that may full on conflict, so you have 2 ways of doing the same thing that then may give you different results, and you have the problem that all of those products, like you said, have vulnerabilities themselves that you then have to manage and remediate and pay attention to. And so you end up with complex, fragile, costly infrastructure. And it's not the fault of so lest you think, oh, well, my CISO is clearly doing a terrible job. No, literally everyone whose company is more than 2 years old has this problem because you've been trying to solve new problems as they arise, and solutions evolve over time. So something that you bought to do thing A may now do things A, B, C, and D, and then you bought other things to do C and D. And so you're maintaining a kind of complicated infrastructure when you don't really need to. But it's hard to go back and look at those things and rip them out of the infrastructure, because that is a hard thing to get budget for, because, oh, you're going to charge me money to take stuff away? How does that work? But it takes time and it takes money. So it's very hard to get done under kind of any kind of cost scrutiny environment.
Okay. So you mentioned outcome-based security. Can you briefly explain what that is and why is it different from what most companies are doing today?
So look, like most good ideas, it's pretty simple once you listen to it. And so what outcome-based security is you have to know what your business's goals are and have all the people who matter agreed on those. And then you have to create your cybersecurity goals to contribute to and support and match those business goals. And those are your security outcomes. And then your task is simple to say but hard to do, which is, okay, we're only going to invest in the things, the programs, the software, the capabilities, whatever, that actually contribute to those security outcomes that we can see a straight line to contributing to what our business needs to do. So it's a long way of saying you line things up in a row and you only invest in the things that are actually going to get the outcomes that you want, as opposed to, I need to deal with this problem and I need to address this risk over here. Instead, you look at it holistically and say, what outcome am I trying to achieve? Or several outcomes am I trying to achieve? And then what do I do that contributes to those outcomes? And what do I stop doing? Because it's not going to contribute to those outcomes, which is sort of the critical part of this.
And I think that's a really valuable conversation to have, because when you talk about outcomes, you can interface with the executives, you can interface with the board of directors, because they can translate these outcomes into the strategy that the organization wants to go towards. And then they can even translate this into monetary figures. But from my perspective as well, when you have the outcomes, then you have the conversation on the upper levels, but you need then to translate it to the risks. But you didn't start with the risks, which means that you could have like 100 risks out there. But if they are not linked to outcomes, then you sort of just have a risk sprawl that you prioritize based on maybe cybersecurity, like how you think this organization could secure its assets. But if you started with the outcomes, before you talk about what are the risks to these outcomes, then you can then talk about what are the assets behind the risks before talking about the threats to the assets. So there could be a continuity of conversation, but it starts from a place where there is alignment and agreement with the people who are actually governing and steering the organization. So this way, like cybersecurity becomes a support, an enabler of business goals, rather than sort of like living a life of its own, just trying to secure the organization the best way it knows how.
So I feel there has been the conversation in information security space about sort of InfoSec supporting the business and not being a hindrance to it. So what's different in this thinking? Have we figured out how to do that finally?
I would love to say that we have. I don't think we're there yet, sadly, which I guess is good, because then I would put the rest of us out of a job. But all kidding aside, though, it's a lot easier to say than it is to do, right? And so what I think is new or different here is we've hopefully all by now figured out that whatever we do in cybersecurity has to actually contribute to, or at least not get in the way of, whatever the company's business objectives are. And what's sort of new and different in outcome-based security is, okay, so we have a set of business outcomes we're trying to achieve. You know, if you're a publicly traded company, you kind of put those in all of your measurements and whatever all else. And your CEO will write them up in their forward-looking 5-year letter and all of those kinds of things. But we also have cybersecurity outcomes that we're trying to achieve that can be more or less granular. And you want to have those things be aligned and not hindering one another. And then the new thing here is to look at everything you do in cybersecurity through the lens of those outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Right.
And so to say, okay, some of this you can sort of get at through things like zero-based budgeting, where you don't just start from, okay, what did we spend last year? How much more do we need? Which is easier. But if you start from zero and go, okay, what do we really need? Oftentimes you'll find some surprising things where you say, why have we been doing that for the last 3 years? We really don't need to. And so then that gives you the capacity, because even if you were one of these fortunate souls whose budget grows by a lot every year and who has most of the staff that they want, please come talk to me, because that sounds fun.
I think that's a myth.
There's got to be at least a couple people out there somewhere who fall into that category. But for most of the rest of us who are not in that position, it's incredibly important to decide what not to do,
Right.
as well as what to do. And so you only have so much time and so many resources and so much money and so many people. And so if you take those outcomes and you say, okay, I've got those linked to what the business is trying to do over the next N period. I am trying to do these things in cybersecurity. We are all aligned on that. Now I'm just going to look at everything we are asked to do, because very often we take requests, and everything, or whether we want to or not, and very often we have new things that happen out in the world, and you say, oh, okay, now I have to do things differently to deal with that. And if you sort of go back and look at the outcomes that you're pursuing and say, does this really affect that outcome that I'm trying to achieve? If not, I am going to ignore it. Now, there may be reasons why I can't ignore it, such as I am legally required to do it.
Right.
So then it doesn't matter if it contributes to your outcome or not. Then your outcome is no one gets fined or goes to jail,
Right.
and that's also important.
Fair.
But, barring situations like that where you don't really have a choice, if you look at everything else through the lens of outcomes, it can be very clarifying, because you can say, okay, this pile of stuff we don't need to do. This pile of stuff we need to do a lot less of. And then there's these 3 things that we really should be doing and aren't. So, let's devote some energy to those 3 things, because otherwise we're not going to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for.
Well, when it comes to these requirements, though, I mean, more and more regulations are coming into play, and more that the cost of doing business in different countries that organizations are going to be operating in is to comply with these cybersecurity regulations that are coming up. So that will most likely be an outcome that organizations would need to achieve in order to just operate.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, those are non-negotiable outcomes.
Yes, exactly.
So you want to add them to your list because you need to remember them, and you don't want them to sort of be off in their own separate category of stuff that becomes invisible.
Yeah.
But yeah, you are going to be constrained in which outcomes you have to put on your list and all the rest of it. I was going to say would that it were not so, but no, it's good that we're required to do a lot of these
Absolutely.
things. Let's be
Absolutely.
honest. There are certain things that are sort of classic moral hazard problems where we all know they're the right thing to do, but it's hard and expensive.
Sure.
And so you don't want to be the only person who's bothering to do them. And if it's legally required, then everyone has to.
Okay, but like legal requirements aside, Christine, I know you've been sort of living this life for a minute now. Do you find it hard to come up with those security outcomes in support of the business outcomes? Like, is this a difficult process?
To be honest, not really. It's harder to prioritize the outcomes. So
Okay.
Because annually, or whatever cadence an organization has, the organization will define strategies. And therefore, it will be quite obvious to everyone in the organization that, for instance, this is the type of the organization who wants to be profitable within a year, or who wants to triple, quadruple their revenues within a certain number of years. So you would know where the business is heading towards. And therefore, the type of outcomes that the business wants to attain, for instance, do they want to be more competitive, to move faster, to have like cheaper technologies, for instance, to be more efficient. So it can be different types of outcomes for the organization based on the strategy that they're heading towards. What's more challenging is discussing with stakeholders that these are the right kind of outcomes that we will be supporting. So for instance, it depends on the organization, there could be multiple outcomes that you will have there, and then there will be multiple risks, many risks under each and every outcome. So it becomes a discussion between, for instance, the executive teams or the leaders of the different units and functions that within these outcomes, these are the risks, and this risk actually needs to be mitigated in your area. Because as the head of cybersecurity within an organization, you can't really mitigate these cyber risks for others. You will need to help them, facilitate them to mitigate the risks in their area. And it becomes a conversation, like as well on them. So this alignment across the organization is a bit more challenging versus actually identifying what are the outcomes that the organization wants to achieve.
Okay. Laura, what do you think? Is it hard for organizations in general to sort of develop that outcome-based mindset?
Yes, which is, I think one of the reasons we haven't necessarily done this as well as we would like in general, because it's easy to get lost in the day-to-day, right? And
Absolutely.
It's very hard to keep strategic focus when you are faced with a lot of crises that you don't get to choose the timing of, which is sort of one of the many hallmarks of the world of cybersecurity, which makes it never boring, which is great, but it also makes it very hard to kind of continually stay focused on top level things like outcomes and business goals. And it's also, I think, one of the sort of salutary effects of a lot of these risks being more visible to the general set of stakeholders is that they're a lot more sophisticated now when you talk to them about risk, because they understand that you can't mitigate every risk, and or it may be cost prohibitive or resource prohibitive to mitigate every risk to whatever level. And so it becomes that conversation that Christine was talking about, where you're negotiating and you're saying, okay, we want to enter this new market that is going to expose us to this set of potential risks. And so in order to stick within the kind of risk tolerance that we've established as a company, we will have to do these things to mitigate those risks to that level. Or if we can't do that for whatever reason, then we have to assess, is that opportunity so compelling that it's worth actually accepting a higher level of risk and saying, we acknowledge that more bad things might happen, but because the upside is large enough, that is okay. The trick there is to keep people from conveniently forgetting that they've all agreed to that, right? Because if you do it like 2 years, because whatever bad thing is going to happen at some completely unpredictable time. And so if, we accepted these risks 5 years ago and 2 of the people who agreed to accept the risk don't work here anymore, that can get a little sticky. So making sure that you review periodically and say, okay, we accepted this set of risks so that we could go get this benefit, and guess what? We've got this fabulously growing business, and it has, it's brought all these benefits to the company. Are we still happy with this? Or maybe have circumstances changed and we can mitigate more of that risk now because better technology is available. We have more resources. So the sort of what we can do doesn't stay static, thankfully, because we acquire more capability and capacity as time goes on. So it's a much more complicated negotiation, I think, than we normally realize, just because you don't take the chance to step back and think about the whole thing. So I think that it's quite complicated, but if you do it correctly and you kind of establish all the joint and shared outcomes and everyone agrees on what we're trying to accomplish, then when things start to go wrong, as they inevitably will at some point, you have that base to start from. And that actually really helps when you're in the middle of a crisis, because then everyone knows what we were trying to do, what we are trying to do now, how all these sort of outcomes contribute to the positive business outcome. And so you don't have to spend a lot of time explaining all those principles to people to get them back on the same page because they're already there. So it can be very helpful for that as well, but it is quite complex to do. And you also have to have the level of trust from your business stakeholders that you know what you're doing and that they should actually listen to you about these broader scale issues, as opposed to like, just please keep us off the front page of the newspaper from bad things happening in the world of cybersecurity. So you have to kind of get beyond that level of engagement.
That's our number one outcome.
Right. So if that's the only outcome on the list, then you're probably not where you would want to be for this to be as effective as you would like.
It's a very reactive method of doing things, though. Like keep us away from the front page of the newspaper. But I do like what Laura has mentioned when it comes to acceptance of risks, because this is really very much associated with the outcomes that the business would like to go through. Because, for instance, if a business would like to be very competitive and to move very fast. A lot of the risks, the cyber risks that comes in, would need to be accepted. But for as long as they are accepted by the right kind of parties in the organization and they are periodically revisited, if they are still the right kind of risks that need to be accepted or they now need to be mitigated, then it's okay. Because the organization and the people who are leading the organization have agreed that because of this outcome, this is how cybersecurity can support the organization.
You're both much more trusting in organizations' sort of risk review process than I am. My experience has been that companies are very happy to write those risk acceptance letters and then put them in the safe when times are good and when the alternative is to do a lengthy project or something to mitigate the risk. But then when those risks actually blow up in your face, they're not very happy with the accepted risks.
They are never happy when things blow up. Nobody is happy when things blow up in the face. But if you have something documented, at least like from a CISO's perspective, when things blow up in the face, then you can go back to that point in time when you decided, well, not you, but when the leader of the unit or the ones who has the power to decide to accept the risk has decided that this is the thing that should happen, then you have that in your hand. If nothing else, then you're not the one who's going to be thrown into the guillotine.
Maybe.
But kidding aside, I mean, the point of that is if that would have been acceptable at that point in time, and it was revisited and it was still acceptable, and the risk manifested anyway, then this is something that the business has already accepted in the first place.
The only thing I think I'd add to that is to make sure that when they accept the risk, they really understand what they're doing.
Exactly.
Because the place you can end up in, and Jana, this might be what you've experienced, is, right, but you didn't tell me that might happen.
Right.
And so it's our job and this is where we have to walk a bit of a tightrope, right? Because nobody wants to be the security person who walks in with the rain cloud over their head
Doom and gloom.
And tells everyone, like, here are all the terrible things that could happen. But don't worry, we're working on it. And because it's not very helpful. And so, but in a situation like this, where we're all going to sign on the dotted line and say, okay, we accept the increased risk of X because the trade-off is worth it, then it's incumbent upon us to make sure they understand really what they're accepting. It's like, okay, so here are the range of possibilities, and here's what I know about how likely they might be. This is what we're accepting. And so if and when this happens, we all have to agree that, yep, we accepted that risk, and now it's time to do damage control, because we reaped the benefits from going after the opportunity that we wanted. And we said, all right, we'll take that risk as a trade-off. Now, sometimes you'll get that wrong, right? And so your stakeholders or shareholders or customers will say, okay, that was not the right decision. We are not happy you accepted that risk. So we are going to take our money and go home. And so that is that's a potential consequence that we all have to think about when we do this. And so you're sort of walking the tightrope between scaring the pants off people unnecessarily and making sure that they understand what they're accepting, so that you don't get to the point where something unfortunate happens and you say, okay, this is what we accepted 2 years ago when we went to do this. And the people at the table say, no, I didn't know that would happen. That's horrendous. We should never have agreed to this. And then you're not in a very helpful place to deal with whatever the crisis is, for sure.
Okay. I find I'm still sort of struggling a little bit, just wrapping my mind around the outcomes, because on a risk level, I think I understand where we are. And on a risk level, like, should we launch this web app without thoroughly testing it? Yes, so that we're the first in the marketplace or whatever. I understand that thinking there, but if we were talking about the very high level and this company's strategy is to, go to market real fast, how do you translate that into a security outcome?
Okay, so let's talk about the web app.
Okay.
Maybe security outcomes, you can think of it like the why behind why you're launching the web app. I mean, why do you want to launch this web app to market really fast? Is there a competitor out there? Are you aiming to be the type of organization who wants to lead this space?
Yeah.
And there's a first mover advantage. So maybe
say that.
Being the first mover advantage would then be the outcome that your organization is aiming to have for whatever reason whatsoever. And therefore, you would need to manage the risks then behind this web app, because this web app that you have is maybe one of the strongest assets that you will have in your organization, because this asset is the one that's supporting the business outcome. So like having that outcome in mind sort of like brings it, especially to the executive table, the picture that, hey, protecting this web app and having all of these security solutions or security capabilities or controls in place for this web app is actually quite important, because we are banking like our organization to gain this outcome of being a first mover advantage on top of this singular asset that we have. Then maybe it's worth a little bit more protection.
Right. Okay. And also in that case, instead of just saying, well, let's not do an audit and let's just go live, maybe we can shift the security left and sort of do things earlier in the process.
That's also a possibility.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That was a helpful example.
And so it might be worth, if you're in the situation that Christine's talking about, saying, okay, so we'd have to spend more money in order to be able to do the audit and do a bunch of testing fast enough so that we can still launch the app on whatever date, and thus we still get the first mover advantage. But that first mover advantage, we think, is worth an amount of new customers and money to us in the market. So then it's worth spending the money to bring in the resources that we need to take the additional security related steps so that you can still launch on time.
Right. Okay. So it's important to understand that we're not talking about a cost saving measure here. We're talking about a measure that will put your costs where they're needed, or spend your money where it actually makes an effort.
Exactly. That's kind of the whole point of this concept of outcome-based security, is the outcomes that you decide on, both business outcomes and security outcomes, are the ones that are going to help your organization succeed. They're going to contribute to being first mover with that web app, or pick whatever the goals are. And so then you take the finite pool of resources that you have and you apply them to those things, rather than trying to, as a colleague of mine likes to put it, spread the peanut butter everywhere.
Right.
And so we need to provide the same level of protection for all the things and do the same level of diligence for absolutely everything, when in reality your resources are finite. And so you want to concentrate those on the things that are going to advance you furthest towards the goals that you have.
Okay. So we're starting to touch upon the benefits of doing sort of a more transparent, outcome-focused security. So let's jump on in. What are the biggest benefits in doing this?
So I think one big benefit that perhaps doesn't sound super exciting, but I think actually is transparency. And so when you have a set of business outcomes that are generally agreed upon, and then a set of security outcomes that contribute to those business outcomes that you've agreed upon, and you're as transparent about communicating those as you can, right? Certainly to all the people at the company, and ideally to your customers and your suppliers and whoever all else as you can, then you will be in a situation where the investment that you're making makes sense. That gives everybody inside of the company the right amount of information so that they can make good decisions, because you can't be there all the time to make sure people make the right decision, right? And so what you want is to make making the right decision as easy and as clear as possible. That's sort of what we strive for in security, because we can't be there standing over people's shoulders, to give sort of silly examples, telling them whether to click on the email or not. You want them to have the right amount of information to know, do I click on this link? Do I read this email, or don't I?
Sure.
And so this kind of outcome-based approach contributes to that transparency, and it also forces you, like we were talking about earlier, to re-examine a bunch of assumptions that are baked into your current operating state that may really no longer be valid, right? Because there are decisions that you made 7 years ago, 5 years ago, that your predecessor made, if you haven't been in your post for 7 years, and that you may not have re-examined just because there was no compelling thing that forced you to. But if you're looking at the set of outcomes that you want to deliver, and then you're looking at all the kind of things that your organization is investing in, you will very quickly find some that are mismatched and that are kind of leftovers from a previous environment, from a previous product set, from a previous go-to-market approach, from who knows what, and a previous set of product decisions that you have since revised, but you still have some stuff left over from the things that you bought 6 years ago that you haven't replaced because it mostly works. But then you realize, oh, I actually have all this other stuff that is better and that I am also paying for. So maybe I should stop using the things I bought 6 years ago and stop making my staff do things twice. And so it sounds like those things should be self-evident, and why did we not figure those out before? And it's because we have jobs to do, and we're not omniscient. And so the kind of outcome-based approach gives you the freedom to re-examine a bunch of assumptions that otherwise might stay baked in for a lot longer than they need to be.
I agree wholeheartedly with Laura, because I mean, a lot of the things, they have a tendency to pile up. And then you can have legacies in place, even legacy processes, not just technologies. And an outcome-based approach allows you to take a step back and take a look at that. And additionally, what I also like about this approach is that the vocabulary is actually more accessible to everyone in the organization. Because the challenge with cybersecurity, and it's also because of us cybersecurity practitioners, is that it has been quite a technical language. So, and then it has been a language about risks. It has been a language about protecting certain types of assets. And this is the language that sort of has been pervasive, like all throughout the industry, that sometimes when we try to bring people in, they're sort of like lost in the conversations that we're having. Because it sounded like cybersecurity becomes a tax for doing business. Because like what business nowadays is not digital anymore. So cybersecurity is a tax, and we just need to do as much of it as possible to make sure that we can secure this business, et cetera, et cetera. And then the decision makers would then ask you, like, can you do that for 50% of your budget? And it becomes that sort of a discussion. But if you have the business outcomes in there, and somebody would then ask for a discount, then it becomes a question of, can you do that for maybe just solve 50% of the risks to these outcomes? So it becomes more real when the outcome, that target outcome that you're trying to minimize the risk for, is actually there on the table. And that conversation can go all the way down to the people who are going to then implement the mitigations for these outcomes.
Okay. That makes sense to me. You've almost convinced me now. What I now want to know is, because this is sounding perfect, are there any sort of pitfalls or sort of typical shoals that we feel that companies might encounter when they're sort of moving towards outcome-based security?
We've talked about one of them, which is in sort of accepting a set of risks, making sure people really know what that means. And I mean, that's not particular to outcome-based security per se. That's going to be a danger, whatever approach you follow.
Right.
But certainly it's a salient thing to think about with this approach also. The other thing that I think we have to watch out for is, interestingly, oversimplifying. Because, so you have your set of 6 outcomes, right? And the sort of general idea is do only things that contribute to those 6 outcomes. There may be a certain level of baseline things that you have to do that may only contribute to 2 of those outcomes, and so may seem lower priority, but Christine and I talked a bunch about there are a whole bunch of regulations and laws that we also have to comply with. So they're going to be a sort of set of things that don't fit perfectly into these contribute to our business outcomes. And so you have to kind of call those out and explain, okay, we're still investing in these 3 things because, and sometimes it's because we have to follow the law. And that's a very simple discussion. But sometimes the answer will be more complex than that. And to say there are some building blocks that you can't get away without paying for. And so if we want to do, I'll give a sort of abstract example in the hopes that this will help. So if we want to do these 3 things that contribute to these 3 business outcomes because they contribute to the cybersecurity outcomes that we've identified as necessary for those business outcomes, but we need a certain level of platform capability to be able to do any of those 3 things. And so we need to invest in that platform stuff, not all of which we may use and not all of which we may need for all of our outcomes, but because you literally can't do any of the vital activities to get to those important outcomes without a certain baseline level of capability, you got to pay for the baseline level of capability first. And so
Right.
if you oversimplify and say, right, everything is going to be focused on these 5 outcomes, then you have to backtrack and explain, no, well, I actually need these platform capabilities because we can't do any of this other stuff without it. And that can be a bit of an awkward discussion to have if you've given a bunch of executive stakeholders the impression that absolutely everything will be perfectly tied to the very small number of fantastic outcomes that you have agreed on. It's sort of you get this sort of seductive simplicity of the strategy looks wonderful on a set of slides. Reality is never going to look as good as the strategy does on slides. And so acknowledging that up front and saying, look, there's going to be some baseline investment that we have to make, not just for legal reasons, but also for having the capacity to actually advance any of these other goals and outcomes. So it's messier than we paint it as when we talk about the sort of abstract level of everything should be focused on these outcomes, I think.
Yeah.
There may be no difference there anyway, related to compliance when it comes to finance or compliance when it comes to legal. Because cybersecurity, the thing that we need to constantly remember nowadays with businesses having both a physical and a digital aspect is that we need to have it. Because unlike physical security, the scope of cybersecurity is much, much wider. It's much, much more global. And it's not like the law enforcement in the country that you're operating in. You can always enforce and chase the perpetrators that are impacting your organization. So it just needs to be there, like the basics that need to be there. But one of the challenges also that I've sort of encountered, and I totally agree with you, because I tried to map some of our risks to outcomes, and then I realized, no, this just needs to be baseline. This just needs to be basic, and it just needs to be there, and that just needs to be accepted. And as a CISO or as a head of cybersecurity within an organization, you just need to be able to translate that into the language of outcomes that, for example, related to just the mere fact that the business exists.
Right. So there is like a level of basic cyber hygiene that sort of has to happen regardless, and it doesn't map neatly into any of the outcomes unless your outcome is, let's try not to get hacked so much.
Well, let's try to survive, more like it.
Right. There's a certain set of baseline stuff that everyone will acknowledge if explained properly you need to do. Just like, you need electricity and running water in your headquarters.
Yeah.
Like, those are non-optional.
Exactly.
But I guess my concern is then, like, for a lot of companies, I would think that a lot of what they're spending on security right now, they feel is going towards essentials. So where do you draw the line between these hygiene basics that you absolutely have to have and the stuff that then starts to map towards specific outcomes more?
I think that's where things are going to get fuzzy.
Right.
Because there's not a sort of do these 7 things. Like, here's your step-by-step guide to deciding where exactly to draw the line between kind of essential baseline services and things that contribute specifically to our business and cybersecurity outcomes. And so I think that's where, quite frankly, the judgment of the CISO in question and how well he or she understands the company comes in. And because if you draw the line too high and you say, all of this stuff is baseline, you kind of forfeit the buy-in of your stakeholders who are saying, like, okay, so what you're telling me is I should give you several $1 million, and then you are going to go do this baseline, or several hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on what size of budget we're talking about here. And you're going to do a set of baseline hygiene things. Remind me again why I'm spending all this money, and like, where are the outcomes that I want for, the things that we've promised to our customers and our shareholders and our employees and so on and so forth. But if you draw the line too low, then you end up without some of the essential capability,
right? And
you'll get to a place where you realize you just signed yourself up for an unacceptable level of risk because you don't have the baseline capacity to do certain things. So I think that's a place worth spending a bunch of time and energy thinking. Yeah. And the line's not going to be in the same place for every business, because, and some of that has to do with risk appetite, some of that has to do with the business that you're in, and who your customers are, which is why, quite frankly, the sort of, you get the mealy mouth "it depends" answer, because it honestly does depend. Like, you can't a priori say all businesses should draw their line here, right? Because it'll be woefully inadequate for a bunch of them. And so making sure that you carve out some time to sit down and really think about that and say, all right, what baseline platform stuff do I really need? And make sure you examine your assumptions, right? Because I think if we're honest, all of us who've worked in this field for a long time have a lot of things that we have learned over many, many years that sometimes aren't true anymore. And so we have to go back and question some of our baselines. Do I really need to still do that? No, I don't. Okay, great. Let's stop doing it. But if you don't actually sit there and think about it, you may run the risk of just letting that practice continue because you're so used to it and it used to be essential, but isn't anymore.
Maybe there's also a part where it really depends where the organization is in its journey, in its existence. Like, for instance, if an organization is very profitable and it's thriving and it's doing very well, then this baseline could be much higher because they have more money to invest and they have profitability that they would like to keep. But if the organization is in survival mode, then cybersecurity would probably need to be in survival mode as well. Now, how do you support the survival of the organization? So this is like what Laura has been alluding to, that this is sort of like a moving target in organizations, and it's fully dependent on what is the behavior, what is the characteristic of that organization at any given point in time.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank you both for being with us today and talking about outcome-based security. You've, for the first time in my life, I've actually understood what we're talking about, and I certainly feel that this is the way a lot of companies will be thinking about security in the days forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That was the show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please get in touch with us through Twitter with the hashtag Cybersauna with your feedback, comments, and ideas. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe.